It's great to be part of this celebration of national sovereignty and the values that make this not only the greatest country in the world, but the greatest place to live, and values that create a better lifestyle for everyone. And thanks for all of you being a part of it. Our third panelist is on the way, Rick Scott, but we have two of the most important and relevant senators to conservative thought in the Senate. You often don't hear the term relevant and senator in the same sentence. The Senate is not I can tell you, someone who's been there, the paragon of vitality. But these two, Mike Lee and Ron Johnson, to me, have been the standouts ever since they came to the Senate. Honored to have them with us. And you should know that not only these two, but Rick Scott, myself, have been sequestered at Camp David for the last week, getting ready for this panel. So everything we say will be very important. But you all know Senator Mike Lee, Utah. He has been a standout since he came. He's been willing to push against the grain and do it in a way that's very civil and friendly, but tough and determined. He leads the steering committee, which is the conservative senators that get together and try to push things in a positive direction. He's been a great friend of mine, as has Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. He came to not join the club, but to change it. He's stood strong ever since he walked in the door. He's been asking, what's the strategy? What are we trying to get done here? And he's been pushing in a way that makes the right people uncomfortable, and I couldn't be prouder to call him my friend. Rick Scott from Florida will be here in a few minutes once he gets through all of the traffic. He has also been a standout, as even before he got into politics, was working to promote free enterprise health care, something he knows a whole lot about. He was a great governor in Florida. And he's certainly been a great senator and stirred things up in a very positive way there. This morning, we want to have a few subjects I'll throw out to them, but I've told them they can talk about anything they would like this morning. There are a few things, though, that have come from them that they may want to discuss. One is just the weaponization of our government against political opponents, which is reached an unprecedented level in the Biden administration. This has been bubbling up for a long time as the bureaucracy has taken more power. We've seen the IRS, we've seen the EPA, throw people in jail for nonsense type of infractions. But now the Biden administration actually using the Justice Department, security agencies against their political opponents is really unprecedented, except in third world countries. And these two may want to talk about that a little bit. The Senate is going to be restructuring. Mitch McConnell has said that he is leaving, and I'd like to hear from... I'll say thank you to that, but there's a lot that's been lost in the Senate that a lot of people aren't aware of. Even when I was there, I know when Mike first got there was more of a dynamic, a lot more of an opportunity for senators to make a difference, bring up amendments. A lot of that has been shut down, not just by one leader, but by a uniparty system in the Senate that I know Mike Lee knows a lot about, as well as Ron Johnson. So I'd like to hear from them on how they see the Senate evolving and being restructured. The third thing is, if we have time, is probably the only thing that will get done this year in the House and the Senate is the funding of the government. And there's been a lot of talk of making that a shorter-term funding bill that would give Trump, as president, the ability to shape things as soon as he gets in there. So those three things, in addition to anything else you'd like to talk about, and you two can have kind of opening thoughts, and then we'll go back and forth. Mike, why don't you start us?
First of all, those are dangerous words to utter to U.S. senators. Just open-ended, talk about whatever you want. But let's start with the first topic that you raised, the weaponization of government. We have to remember something about the left in order to understand what we're experiencing right now and what we've got to do to push back on it. To the progressive Democrats, and they almost all fit into that category currently, they like to phrase things lately in terms of the rule of law. But what they mean by the rule of law is that they are the rule of law. And if you run contrary to them, you're going to find yourself at the opposite end of the rule of law. So think of, for example, Bannon, Eastman, Navarro, Meadows, to say nothing yet about the prosecutions against President Trump. They got sideways with the progressive Democrats. And as a result, they figured out a way to make the law turn on them. They got sideways with the rule of law as conceived by the progressive Democrats, and so they found themselves at the receiving end of this lawfare campaign. And so these guys do everything they can in order to defend it in terms of the rule of law. They call anyone who pushes back on it, who questions it, they accuse them of fighting against the rule of law. Then when the only institutions that can do anything about it to actually defend the real rule of law, when they try to step in, or when there's even a chance they might step in, then they'll push back against the courts, principally the Supreme Court, and say that the Supreme Court is trying to destroy the rule of law. And to that end, they try to pack the Supreme Court. This is their objective. Because they see themselves as the rule of law, they want to push back against the Supreme Court of the United States. Why? Well, because it's the one thing that can make sure that the law actually governs here. This is a big problem, and it's a huge problem when you look at the volume of federal laws that can be implemented, the concentration of power that's happened at the federal level. When you look at laws like the FACE Act, which is this odd hodgepodge of, it's a dog's breakfast. It allows the government to prosecute you if you protest at or engage in violence or otherwise disrupt the proceedings of an abortion clinic, a pregnancy center, or a church. Now, the Biden administration constantly brings prosecution for actions taken at abortion clinics, and they do absolutely nothing about pregnancy centers or churches, even though that's where acts of violence are abounding. And so that's how you end up with guys like Mark Houck, this young father of young children, who was prosecuted under the FACE Act for praying at an abortion clinic, was pulled out by a SWAT team in the middle of the night in front of his young children, even though his own lawyer had offered up that he would self-surrender if they needed him to come and appear. This is the kind of thing that we're facing. And it's not going to stop at Bannon, Eastman, Navarro, Meadows, and Trump. They're coming after you. And so that's why today's discussion is so important, because the Senate can be, should be, must be one of those bulwarks against this sort of abuse of the law and abuse of government power. And we'll get to that when we talk about restructuring the Senate later.
That gets us, thank you, Mike. Ron, we'll go to you. And Rick, I've already introduced you as the most brilliant, prominent senator of a generation, and but that was too long an introduction. But we're just going to cover a few.
And Mike and Ron didn't disagree yet.
But I won't let. We're talking about really weaponization of government and several other things. But I'll give you a heads up when we get there. Ron.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jim, and thank all of you for attending. What you have in front of you with the three of us is you got a legal scholar, and I always do appreciate having come from the business sector. I get top-notch legal advice for free from Mike Lee, so I appreciate that. I'm the accountant business guy, and Rick Scott's both. I mean, he's a lawyer, but he also is just an unbelievably accomplished business person, as well as a very successful governor. So we have an interesting blend of personalities here that we meet every Tuesday morning at 9. It's generally the three of us. A couple other people join. It's been dubbed the Breakfast Club. But I'll take up the second topic in terms of how do you get the Senate to operate. And it's really twofold. There's the Republican conference, and then there's the overall Senate. Jim kind of mentioned the beginning of a quote that I heard when I was thinking about running for Senate in 2010. I was actually driving to an Americans Prosperity conference in the Wisconsin Dells, and I heard Jim being interviewed by Glenn Beck. And I heard Jim say, we don't want people coming here to join the club. We want people coming here to join the fight. And that resonated with me, and quite honestly, it was one of the reasons I decided to run. Unfortunately, all we've been doing is fighting ever since, internally as well as externally. Now, I would prefer that most of our fighting effort is against the people who are literally destroying this country. Jim mentioned the fact that coming from the private sector, one of the first things I noticed about Washington, D.C. is there's like no strategy. None. Zero. Zip. The House might as well be 500 miles away from the Senate for lack of coordination. So I give Jim DeMint a great deal of credit. I went up to him early on because I really came to be an ally of Jim DeMint and Tom Coburn, the two rock-ribbed conservatives that I was looking at in 2010 before I got here. And I went to Jim one day and said, can we have dinner? I really want to start picking your brains. Again, you have no time to really get to know your colleagues here. You get scheduled up to the wazoo, and you fly in, you fly out, and you just don't have that relationship. So I asked Jim, let's get together. He said, well, I'll do you one better. Let's invite some House members. What a concept. And so that was really, Jim had a townhouse, and that's where I met Jim Jordan and Mick Mulvaney and some other really great conservatives in the House, and really set up the template for what now Rick Scott did beginning of this year. The only reason we got through the debt ceiling, it wasn't because of moderates, it wasn't because of liberals, it was literally because of conservatives led by Rick Scott, who held relentlessly dinner after dinner, week after week with House conservatives, those of us who had never voted for a debt ceiling increase, realizing unless we're willing to support one, we're going to get nothing for it. And so it was literally the House members, the Freedom Caucus guys, that came up with a bill, introduced it, compromised with moderates in the House to increase the debt ceiling by $1.5 trillion, but setting caps. Now, unfortunately, what happened is House leadership took that deal and didn't go do a deal with Biden to increase the debt ceiling by $1.5 trillion. He just suspended it. And that's been our problem. What Jim DeMint did when he was in the Senate, he was always looking for points of leverage. Having a strategic brain going. There aren't many times when you literally have some leverage to try and get something done conservatively here. You got the uniparty that loves spending money we don't have. And so what I've been trying to do in my main effort has always been pushing some level of strategy, always around some kind of leverage. The debt ceiling is one thing. Spending bills is certainly one. But I guess my latest effort, and I'll close on this note, in order to repair the Senate, we need to first repair our confidence, and we have an opportunity here. I think both of us are going to be big supporters of Rick Scott running for leadership. But what I also think we need is a mission statement. It's also pretty foreign to Washington, D.C. So the mission statement I proposed, and it's been modified based on a little discussion we had last night, pretty simple, one sentence: to fight and defeat the ideology and policies of progressive Democrats that are destroying this country. Now, I presented that to our conference, and immediately had people start, well, we need to be more positive. We should talk about what we're for. We're for opportunity. Okay, yeah, that's true. But at this moment in time, conservatives have to recognize what is happening to our country. We have to open our eyes. And the radical left, progressive Democrats, same thing. Progressive Democrats are literally destroying this country. So our first task is we need to fight and defeat them. That has to be done. So it starts in November, and we're going to need your help.
Ron, thank you. Senator Scott, we threw out 3 subjects, but you can talk about anything you want. One was weaponization of government. One was restructuring of the Senate and how to make the place work. The other thing is what do we do with the spending this year? That is one point of leverage that we might have. So again, appreciate you being here. We'll let you open with anything you like, and then we'll have a discussion.
Sure. Well, first, I'm sorry I was late. I met Jim DeMint when I came up here in 2009 when Obamacare was starting up, and it seemed like he was the only guy in the Senate that was willing at the time to really be a leader in trying to fight it. And it was a tough time for the Senate because I guess they'd just gotten, to 60 votes on the Democrats, so it was a very tough time. But he fought the whole time. I've been up here 5.5 years, and you should admire Mike Lee and Ron Johnson because, let me tell you, it's a pain in the butt. Here's a club. It's a club, and if you don't go along with them, you're ostracized. Here's how different it is than a business life. So I'm a business guy. Ron and I both ran businesses. If Mike he'd been very successful. But in business, what you do is you have a plan. As Mike said, you write up a mission statement, you have a plan, you surround yourself with a management team, and then you bust your butt every day. And you have competition, you have problems, and you use all your leverage. We don't do anything like that up here. There's nothing like that. There's no conversation like that. So what we have up here in the Senate, we have two dictatorships. We have the McConnell dictatorship on the Republican side and the Schumer dictatorship on the Democrat side. And basically, it's caused by, one, each of our conferences have given the leader a lot of leeway and power, all right? In business, even though I was always the CEO because I started the companies, you had to, and people always ask me, how'd you get that title? I said, I gave it to myself. He wouldn't have hired me. But what you had to do in business, what you did is you'd write your strategy, you'd build your team, and then you'd work with your team and you'd talk to each other. You didn't have all the brilliant ideas yourself. But this place is run by two dictatorships. McConnell's got his dictatorship and Schumer's got his dictatorship. They decide. We don't have bills that go through committee hardly at all anymore. They decide on the bills, they come to the floor, and we either vote yes or no. No amendments, we vote yes or no. And that's spending bills, almost everything. That's what we're doing. How does that make any sense? Like, everybody up here, all 100 of us, come up here with some different background, but we don't get to use it at all. And part of it is because we've given it to them. Part of it is because how the money flows. And so this has got to change. You've got to start running this place like there's 100 of us that represent our states. Like I ought to represent Florida. Ron ought to represent Wisconsin. Mike ought to represent Utah. And you know what? We ought to fight for our states. And if we all did that, this place would be a lot better place. We wouldn't have $35 trillion worth of debt. So I put out an economic report every quarter. Sent to all the Republicans in the House and the Senate, just to give people talking points to make sure they understand it. You know, there's other people that really understand the budget, but one person you really ought to admire that's been up here for a while, has understand the budget, is Ron Johnson. He talks about it all the time because he's an accountant. He cares about this stuff. But up here, it's like we raise the debt ceiling. Nobody cares. We have a spending bill. Nobody cares. We have 8,000 earmarks. Nobody cares. I mean, this has got to change. It's going to start. If we elect a Republican leader that says, you're not going to have the job forever. 2, bills are going to go through committee. We're going to have a real appropriations process. We actually could do this. Our states do it. I walked in when I was governor in 2010, when I got elected, with a big budget deficit. I balanced the budget every year. The state had not. Everybody thinks these states balance their budget. No, they don't. They borrow money. It's a lie. My state had borrowed money every year for 40 years. Only 1 year had lived within its means. We were going into default on our debt. And you think Florida was well run. So this is all fixable, but we got to start with electing. We got to elect better Republicans, but also better leaders.
Mike, I know you're on the edge of your chair, so I know you're ready to say something.
I was just going to say, I'm going to jump on board the Ron Johnson admiration train here. Ron is also, he's an expert in so many things.
And he cares.
So Ron is also known for his charts. He comes up with the most amazing charts. I don't know how he does it, but he's got this immigration chart that he's perfected over years, and it shows exactly the flow, the average daily encounters, known gotaways, and all this stuff. And his charts are so good that the 45th president of the United States one day was presenting it. And I saw Trump. He was down at Mar-a-Lago. Here's this amazing chart. It's a beautiful chart, the best chart you've ever seen. I put this together. It's my chart. And I've seen this chart for years, and I was like, that's the Ron Johnson chart, but I was looking for the logo produced by Ron Johnson, and he had it wiped clean. So I guess that's brilliant chart.
Yeah. I want to echo one of the things you said, which when I first came to really the House 25 years ago, it seemed reasonable as a guy who'd just been in business that, hey, we need to work with the other side to come up with consensus to move the country in the right direction. I think that's still a philosophy and maybe a belief that's held by a lot of Americans. Why can't the Republicans and Democrats work together? But there is no reasonable consensus between what you believe today and what the progressive Democrats want to do to our country. And the only way to deal with it is what you said, is we have to beat them. And that's a different mindset than working with them. It's not our friend on the other side of the aisle, even though I wish it would be. It's a real battle, and I think the problem we've had with the Senate leadership, and you know this with McConnell, is his philosophy is always don't be the issue. Don't do anything. Just wait till it gets up to a crisis and then he can solve it, and the Wall Street Journal will say he's a hero, but the fact is that we end up with very bad policy at the end of every year. Is there any hope? There's normally kind of a progression of musical chairs where the next guy in line takes over. Is there any hope of changing that? Ron, I'll start with you.
There always has to be hope. Part of the problem, and I didn't hear this directly, but I've heard the comment attributed to McConnell that, show me a member of Congress who ever lost the election because they spent too much money. So that's an attitude of our leadership, and that's not helpful. But one of the ways you can gain consensus is, first of all, have common information. I'm going to quick tell you a story. This was, I think, about 3 omnibuses ago. This is really the first omnibus where, even though it's a conference position, and fought over when I first got here about banning earmarks. Tom Coburn, you guys were leaders, And within our conference, listen, there are legitimate reasons, let's not let the president make all the spending decisions. So there are legitimate arguments on the other side, but as Coburn always says, earmarks are the gateway drug. And so we had a conference position, no earmarks, we weren't going to support it until all of a sudden our conference was voting for earmarks. Our leader negotiated it. So it was during that omnibus, I think it was the tail end of 2022, and I asked our Senate conference, there's 40 whatever of us, might have been the majority back then, anybody know how much we spent last year, the federal government? And just like this, nobody said anything. I'm sure people like Rick and Mike had an idea, but nobody offered. And so I had to let them know. I went out then in the hallway and talked to the press, asked them the same question. These are all the smart journalists that are supposed to be reporting on this, right? Step back. Remember, the United States government is the largest financial entity in the world. Nothing even comes close. And I asked the press, how much we spent last year? And one reporter said, well, it's like over $1 trillion. No, that's just discretionary spending. That's less than 30% of our budget. Anybody know how much? Nobody knew. The answer was over $6 trillion. So when you don't even, let's face it, we're on the board of directors, the largest financial entity in the world, and I would say the vast majority of members of Congress had no idea what total federal government spending was. And I'll put it in context, then I'll shut up. In 2019, before the pandemic, in total we spent $4.4 trillion. Okay, during the pandemic, listen, even I had to hold my nose and vote for first CARES Act, but that was the last one. We had to do something fast and massive so that markets wouldn't collapse. We did have to act. I understand that. I knew it was going to be imperfect. But we spent over $6 trillion that year, and we never looked back. We never rejiggered the baseline. And you gave me credit for graphs. One of the best stats on this is what Rick Scott looked at. He said, our population is growing at less than 2%, but spending's up 60%. There's no justification for okay, 1 year aberration, the pandemic, you spend over $6 trillion, but then go back to 4.5, 4.6. Now, this year we'll spend about $7 trillion. Biden's budget, I think it's $16 trillion in debt over the next 10 years. No year with less than a deficit less than $1.5 trillion. So again, it's for hope. You have to have information. You have to have an informed board of directors in terms of what's happening. And with a leader like Rick Scott, who's already giving us this information, he'll be pounding it into our conference's brain. This is what we're dealing with. This is how we're going to have to solve the problem.
Rick?
So first off, just think what we've done to our society. How many people, we have about 330 million Americans. How many Americans 16 to 64 are not working? Anybody know? As a number, what would you guess? 20 million maybe? Yes? 100 million. 100 million people in this country, 16 to 64, are not working. Think about what would happen to our revenue if everybody got back to work. Why aren't these people working? Well, we have every program under the sun. You have a program for everything. At the local level, we do it. At the state level, we do it. At the federal level, we do it. We have incentivized people not to work. So if you think about the biggest issues we're dealing with right now, the border's at number one, inflation is number two. Look at what their Federal Reserve did to us. When Barack Obama got elected, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was $800 billion. Under Bernanke, Yellen, and Powell, it got to $9 trillion. Why? Because they wanted to keep long-term interest rates down. Jay Powell is the only person in our lifetime in the world ever that's lost $1 trillion in a year. He doesn't have to mark to market. Even now, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is not even close to value, and they have no capital. Right? So how can interest rates come down when we have to now refinance $8 trillion worth of treasuries a year because Yellen and Powell are keeping everything short, and we're going to run $2 trillion deficits? So if that's not going to come, if interest rates are not coming down and gas is not coming down, when you have a federal government that's trying to kill oil and gas production, how can inflation come down? We're killing the poorest families in this country, the ability to get ahead. And then we've regulated so nobody even started a business. My first business was a donut shop. You know how many rules and regulations I had to comply with? I don't know of any. Today, I mean, you can't comply with all the junk out here. And then, like what Mike said, they weaponize it. So if you, for God's forsake, you ever violate one of it and you say the wrong thing, oh, they're going to go after you. So as a business guy, you're going to invest in that market if you don't have to? No, you're going to invest less. You're going to take less risk. We're killing our economy.
Now that we've scared everybody to death, let's talk about how we're going to fix it. And the Senate's a key part of that, and I think everything we've brought up, the possible restructuring, the point of leverage that we're going to have with spending, how do we start to move this in a different direction? Of course, a different president would help, but different leadership in the Senate and the House could help. So how do we turn this ship around?
I believe that the biggest problems we have in our society are from our government. The biggest problems with our government have to do with the excessive consolidation and accumulation of power in the hands of the few. So, and I'm getting there to the conference governance, but I've got to set this up. We've consolidated government in our country in several ways. We've ignored the twin structural protections of the Constitution. We've taken power away from the American people in 2 steps. First, we've taken it from the people where the government power is supposed to be exercised primarily at the state and local level, and we've moved it to Washington, disrupting the vertical protection we call federalism. Then, once it gets to Washington, we've moved it a second time away from the people, away from the people's elected lawmakers in Congress. We've moved it over to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, loosely under the jurisdiction of the president, but not always, thus disrupting the horizontal protection we call separation of powers. That consolidation has not served us well, and it's led to a federal government that's too big and too expensive. But there is a more subtle accumulation of power, concentration of power, that's also been harmful, and it's happened within Congress, within the 2 branches, the 2 chambers of the legislative branch, the House and the Senate. The power has been accumulated in the hands of what I call the firm, the law firm of Schumer, McConnell, Johnson, and Jeffries. The other Johnson, not this one. The top Republican and the top Democrat in each legislative chamber of the Congress has taken on so much power that all this authority has been delegated to them. Now, Ron referred a minute ago to what happened during the last debt ceiling discussion. The House really did put together this great debt ceiling package that raised the debt ceiling, but only with very strict spending caps, with passage of the REINS Act, which would require Congress to enact federal regulations, major rule regulations, before they took effect. A lot of major reforms that would have helped us not get back into the debt loop really quickly, where we'd be coming back to the well to raise the debt ceiling again in the near-term future. But then the firm short-circuited that whole thing, even after the House had passed that very aggressive measure. All they had to do, all the House had to do, was pass that and say, that's it, we raised it, now it's time for the Senate to act, and then wait for things to play out. We had something that they desperately wanted, and so we could have gotten action there, but the firm interrupted. So, conference governance. What I'm looking for, and I think what we desperately need in this country, is for the Senate to be able to function as the Senate, where each state is equally represented. Our rules are different than they are in the House. Well, we are allowed theoretically, potentially, unlimited debate, the opportunity to offer up amendments. That, too, has been short-circuited by the firm because everybody's just deferred to their party leader in their respective legislative chambers. That hasn't served us well. So what we're looking for is for our new leadership structure to focus on equality among Senate Republicans. Each of us has an equal certificate to be there. Each of us ought to be able to utilize our prerogatives. And what that means is we need to democratize the United States Senate, at least as far as Senate Republicans are concerned. And that relates to everything from committee assignments to the ability to offer up amendments on the floor, the ability to have input on the legislative calendar when we turn to what, rather than having all these things, all these decisions made by one guy. That's been a big problem, and that's what gives me hope about the opportunity that we have this November after the general election. I actually hope that we can push the leadership election back to early December so that we have a few weeks to have this discussion in earnest. But I've started already, and I've circulated a letter among Senate Republicans outlining what I think the reforms need to be. But they all have one thing in common: the disaccumulation, the distribution of power that's previously been consolidated in one person.
Thank you, Mike. Great thoughts. Ron?
So I'm a big believer in the KISS principle, keep it simple. And so if you're, again, I come from a manufacturing setting, so you solve a lot of problems. And there's just a process you go through. You have to first admit you have a problem. Second step, you have to properly define it. Hopefully find root causes. Then you start working on solutions. And by the way, compromise is the very last step in that process. I've heard so many politicians say that it starts with compromise. No, that's the last step in the process. So we got a big problem. We can admit that. So let's define it. It truthfully is a massive government that's completely out of control, spending too much money, which is going to harm economic activity. So we need to fix that problem and recognize that the number one component of a solution for most of our problems is economic growth. And good news is we know how to grow our economy. You do it through reasonable regulation. You don't overregulate. You don't overtax. You utilize your God-given energy resources. You do have a secure border so that you're not plunking like New York City spend about $4.8 billion just paying for the illegal migrants, the very small percentage of the 6, 7, 8 million that the Biden administration has let in. So you focus, you got to prioritize those problems, you have to properly define them, and the good news is we've got a presidential candidate whose first task will be to secure the border, and that's just a open wound to our country right now. That's got to be fixed. And then focus on economic growth. Don't increase people's taxes. I'll close on this note. A big problem with the 2018 tax cut, it did work, gave us a great economy, but only one portion of it was permanent. For 5% of American businesses, the C Corps. I'm the guy that fought and dug my heels and said, I'm not going to vote for this thing until you at least give a tax break to 95% of American businesses, the pass-throughs. We got that, but we didn't have a big enough score because three people made that decision for all of us. It wasn't a conference decision. It was, three people, led by McConnell, said we're going to stick to a $1.5 trillion static score. We had no way then to make the rest of this permanent. So the first goal of what we're going to have to do now in 2025, 2026 is any tax reform we do, I don't even like using that word, I'd rather say tax simplification and rationalization, we need to make it permanent. We need to make it rational based on basic principles like income is income, tax income at the ownership level only once, not multiple times. Again, there are things we can do if we focus on it. I know a lot of people are talking about let's just extend the tax cuts. I think that'd be a mistake. It's a massive score, and I think we should think outside the box, a paradigm shift, and simplify and rationalize our tax system. That will give us economic growth, and that's, again, the number one component of a solution.
Rick, you've been willing to stand on the railroad tracks in front of the leadership status quo. What do you think is going to happen, and how can we get the Republican conference to fight against the status quo?
So let me just finish what they talked about on the budget. It's really actually pretty simple to balance a budget. You know how you do it? You do it what you do every day. You say my income's X, my expenditures are not going to be more than that. It's not that hard. When I walked into Florida, we had a $4 billion budget deficit. There's 4,000 lines of budget. I spent a month and a half. I'd never looked at the budget before. Went through every line in the budget and said that our revenues are going to be $70 billion. We're not spending more than $70 billion. So as a group, we're going to come up with how we're going to balance the budget, and we did. And then, as a result of then doing the other things that they talked about, the regulatory reform, the permitting reform, we dramatically grew jobs, added 1.7 million jobs. Revenue skyrocketed. It's the same thing here. And as Ron said, we shouldn't just do point blank the Trump tax cuts. What are the things that could actually grow our economy? So on the leadership race, I think it should come down to this. I think it should come down to how do we want to be led, not how do we want to be governed. I mean, the leadership job is a leadership job. So if you're a CEO of a company, so when I had 285,000 employees, I found really smart people, and we listened to them. Now, if we couldn't come to an agreement, somebody had to make the final decision. I'd make the final decision. So in the end, that's how this place ought to be operated. We ought to all come together. We ought to have a conference meeting and say, oh, take any issue you want to talk about, and say, listen, what are all the ideas? And then at the end, say, okay, now this is the consensus. Does anybody disagree with this? I mean, if you look at the Wednesday dinners we're having with the House, it's really the three of us and 6 to 15 people in the House, depending on the week. That's all we're doing is we're saying, okay, so here's all the ideas. We're all throwing out our ideas, and what's the consensus that we could go down a path that would work? So what we've got to do is we've got to say to ourselves, that's how we want to be led. Now, there's a fight. There's people that actually believe that we ought to give way more power to whoever is our elected leader, and they make all the choices for the period of time they have the job. You don't do that in business. I mean, dictatorships in business fail. I mean, you can't. One person can't be so smart. Out of in any of our businesses, one person can't know all the ideas. It just can't happen. So we've got to do that, and then go through the process of like what Mike talked about. Part of the way the process would work better is if it went through a committee, actually, one, you'd have buy-in, you'd have everybody's idea. If you had robust amendment process on the floor, then how, like if I get my stuff in the bill, and I've made the bill better, then how can I be against it? But if no one even talks to me, go jump in a lake. I'm not voting for your stuff. I mean, how would you think about it in your business life? If your boss doesn't listen to a word you said, I mean, you don't buy into that job. And that's what they're doing. We're not buying into our job. You come up here, what I've learned pretty quickly is you come up here and you're just told. They tell you when we're working. They're telling you, they dictate what's your committee. And by the way, don't go against McConnell because you'll be kicked off of committee. I mean, how does one person have the right to do that? So it wasn't. I didn't run against McConnell. The three of us actually, with some other support, ran against McConnell at the end of 22. So Ron and Mike nominated me. And so what happened is Mike and I were on Commerce, and we got kicked off the next day. And it was so nice because they told me by text. I don't know how they called you at least, right? I guess that goes with seniority. So I was in there long enough to get a call. I only got a text. That's wrong. I mean, like in my case, I ran a big company. In my case, we did 80% of the Republican amendments on the Commerce Committee. And actually, the chair is a Democrat. We didn't have a bad relationship with her. I disagree with a lot of her stuff, but we got our stuff done. She supported a lot of our stuff. So what we're doing is that's how we're going to get this change. In the end, it's easy to balance a budget if you decide you want to do it. This process has got to get fixed. And we can win, but all of you can weigh in. Write articles. Weigh in. How do you think we ought to be run? Do you think we ought to be run as a dictatorship where, whoever the replacement for McConnell is and Schumer continues this? If you do, write that. I completely disagree with that. I had my success in business because I surround myself with people way smarter than me, and I took their best ideas and I implemented them. I just had the nice title.
Mike, any chance we can change this? I know there's a tendency of just keep going along in the Senate. Most of the members become risk averse, keep their head down, And just like you've pointed out, going against the leadership chain can cause a lot of problems. Do you see any change of attitude among the Republican members?
I do, and I believe there is hope. There is hope to turn this thing around. I say there is hope because we can do it, and we will do it because we must do it. Let me put it this way. We are sailing in some really, really treacherous waters right now. This weaponization thing is for real. They are out for every one of us. They're out to destroy our liberty. Ultimately, government power has an inverse relationship with freedom. Every time government acts, every time it expands, it does so at the expense of individual liberty. And it's doing that more than ever. It's raging against us every single day. The Senate is the one and only bulwark against weaponization. We are the last stop. We are the goalie. We are the drummer. We are the backstop of everything. And we have that luxury because of the way we're set up, because of our constitutional structure, because we have 6-year terms, and because of our rules and our customs, if we will allow them to work. But we do have to make them work, and the only way to make them work is to re-democratize the Senate Republican Conference. There is a craving for this among our conference. People have been penned in, they have been held back for years and years and years. And this dam's getting ready to break. It's going to be glorious when it does. Think about it this way. If we allowed ourselves to be free to exercise the full prerogatives of United States senators, we could flip a lot of the paradigms in favor of liberty. You see, that's what the Senate's existence, the equal representation among the states, that's what our rules and our customs and our 6-year terms all allow. Think about the filibuster, for example. A lot of people, including conservatives, when Republicans are in charge at the White House, the House, and the Senate, they complain about the filibuster. Think about it differently. The filibuster means that any 40, even with squishes, even without a supermajority of 60, some Republicans will start telling you soon, those who are maybe more of the uniparty ilk, oh, we don't have 60, so we can't accomplish too much. Nonsense. What that means is that 41 of us, any 41 of us, can stop something from passing. And if 41 of us can stop something from passing, we can get a lot done. We can be that bulwark against weaponization, which we must do. But the restoration of the Senate is the only way to make that happen.
Ron?
So, one thing I actually appreciate that McConnell did is announced early so we could go through this process. And I think it's been really very helpful. I think one of his abuses of power is he would always call an election a week after the November election. Gave nobody any time to challenge him whatsoever. So again, I just view that as abuse of power. When I nominated Rick, and both of us were honored to be able to do that in the old Senate chamber, I basically framed the race for this Congress as a business person's approach, and I think you've heard that out of Rick. And again, there are very few business people in the world that have accomplished what Rick Scott has done. I mean, what was it? You were the 8th largest employer in America, incredibly successful governor. So it'd be a business-like approach. And you just heard how he would go through the budget versus business as usual. And that's what we have facing us today. I wish I could be as optimistic as Mike that, there's just all kinds of enthusiasm for a change. We've got a broad spectrum in our conference. It's just a fact. We have Republicans from states like Wisconsin, pretty purple, some quite blue. We got some really red states. So you're going to have a broad spectrum, and I'd much rather have a senator, even in a blue state, with an R behind their name than a D. So, we have to understand that and accommodate that broad spectrum, which is why, again, I continue to push reality. And I think there's one thing I think Washington in general needs, and certainly Congress, is having their eyes open to what is happening to our country. I think there is a bubble in Washington, D.C. It's very thick. And, it's elite. And I don't think enough members of Congress truly understand what the American people are going through. I don't think they truly understand the threat that we all face, how this precious thing we call America is in peril. So from my standpoint, I think the best chance we have of electing Rick as our leader and having that business-like approach is to just force the discussion on our colleagues in terms of what the reality situation is. And I would be hopeful that if President Trump got elected, I would hope he would take a look at potential leaders in the Senate and say, you know, I'd really like to work with another business guy, and Rick Scott, I'd really appreciate him being leader. That could certainly help our cause.
Rick, one of you said, which I think is probably the best campaign message for you as leader, is the idea is not to be a dictator and tell all the different senators what to do, but to in fact be a facilitator of a democratic process where every state, as Mike says, is equally represented, that every senator has the opportunity to participate. I think if you can convince the Republicans that that's your approach, I think sometimes they like a leader who's just going to protect them from tough votes. And they don't want all these amendments to come up because it's going to make them look bad because they have to take a vote. So that's part of electing somebody who doesn't want to do anything. But can you convince the Republicans that a new style of leadership would actually be beneficial to a broad spectrum in the conference?
I think so. I'm optimistic. I mean, what I'm doing is I'm going around talking. I've got meetings today with different senators, and so I'm going to say, do you like the process? Man, are you happy with the way this is happening? Do you feel like you're heard? Do you get your message out? So it's been well received so far. I've not talked to everybody, but in the end, I think it's really gonna be a clear choice, and whenever we decide, it's gonna be: do you want to continue the process of being dictated to, or do you want somebody that's, I think the better word is what Jim just used, a facilitator. If people think that business people are leaders of businesses are dictators, they're not. You don't get ahead that way. You might have to make a decision, but you do it because you bring people together to work together to get a common cause. That's how successful businesses are done. And so people have a totally misconception of how it works. So actually, I'm optimistic. People, when we ran a little less than 2 years ago, when we talked about term limits, nobody was interested in term limits for the leader. That's actually being received now. How can you argue that things shouldn't go through committee? How can you argue that we shouldn't have amendment votes? You can't argue. And so I don't know, I'm optimistic. I'm going to keep talking to people. We'll see. But I think the other thing is what Ron said. We're in trouble. The public's pretty mad. So this is my election year, so I've already done all 67 counties this year in my state. The turnout is big, and you'd like to say, oh, it's all because they think I'm a great senator. I think a lot of it is they're mad. They said this doesn't work. In Florida, Trump is doing unbelievably, by the way. He is, and I think it is because he's what Ron talks about. He's fighting. He's willing to fight again away from all this stuff. So I'm actually optimistic. That people want to change. They're tired of not solving problems. We have big problems.
Probably the only chance you have to make a difference this year is on the spending fight. That's a point of leverage. What is the strategy? Are you working with the House? What is the chance to leverage what little power you have in the Senate to not do a full year omnibus or not to do a CR that lands in December, which always ends in disaster? So, Mike?
One of the dumbest things that we could do is allow a lame duck session to occur. And the dumbest thing we could do within a lame duck session is to pass an omnibus spending bill. What we need to do and what I'm advocating for is for the House of Representatives to take the lead and to pass a 6-month continuing resolution. So the current fiscal year, of course, ends at midnight on September 30th. And I think they should punt the spending decision forward through a CR that would take us to March. And then say, that's it, no more spending bills this year, we're going home. And that way there's no mischief that can occur. If we do it that way, I think we win, and we keep as much flexibility for President Trump when he comes on board as possible. If we don't do that, we're going to lose. If I can add to that, let me just add one more comment on this other discussion we were talking about, reform within the conference. This is one of the things that we've got to reform about the conference. The law firm of Schumer, McConnell, Johnson, and Jeffries historically writes these omnibus spending bills, holds them back until hours before the end, and then says, okay, you got to vote for this. Trust me, it's good, but you're not going to be able to amend it. You can't read it. You can't debate it with your constituents. You'll have at most 48 hours to figure out what's in it, but no amendments. You can't take out the hundreds of earmarks we put in here. But if you vote against it, which you can, and the government shuts down, we will blame you for a shutdown. And they do. I've done it many times and been blamed, and it happens. But that's the kind of thing that's happened over and over again. That's the abuse that gives me some confidence. Now, that doesn't mean that we have a majority yet. But from the dawn of time, the cause of freedom has always turned not on who can get everyone to agree with them or even necessarily who can get a majority, but just enough. We don't necessarily have to have a majority of the conference immediately. We just have to have enough, and then enough others who, for whatever reason, will join with us. That's how we're going to win. And the chronic mismanagement of the spending bill process is the number one reason why I think come this fall we're going to have enough.
Ron?
So the siren song to a president-elect Trump will be, you don't want to have to put up with the spending fight right off the bat. I mean, you got a lot of stuff to do here. Let us take care of this, and then we can worry about, and we can do all the things you want to do in fiscal year 2026. That would be the wrong approach to take. Because I think if President Trump gets elected, it's because people want him to fight. And so let me just, I'll close on the mission statement that I'm proposing, not only for the Republican Senate Conference, I would like this for conservatives in general, to fight and defeat the ideology. I mean, all these ideologies, transgenderism, the mutilation of children, I mean, we can go down the list, to fight and defeat the ideology and policies of progressive Democrats, the radical left, that are literally destroying this country. That's what we need as a president. That's what we need to do as Republicans, as elected Republicans in Congress. That's what we need your support to accomplish.
Well, thank you. So, Rick, you could certainly comment on the funding, but I think we've got three of the best minds in the conservative movement sitting on stage. We've got a new group here called National Conservatism, which the whole idea is to refresh, refocus conservatism on the importance of sovereignty and those ideas that make countries great. And so I would love for you maybe just to comment on conservative thought, as well as if you want to go back to spending, that's fine, but we've only got about 6 minutes left, so I thought we'd get a few thoughts that might help these folks who are building a fresh conservative movement.
Well, first off, thank you for doing it. It works. I mean, what we know is what our founders wrote in the Constitution actually has worked. The way the judicial system was set up, the legislative system set up, the executive branch was set up, it actually does work. And it's actually good for every family in this country, because what it does is it gives everybody the opportunity to live their dream without somebody telling them what to do. Every one of us has our story of how we got where we got. But it all starts with the fact that we had parents that told us, or somebody told us, that we could be anything, because in this country, the way the country was set up, there was no limitation of what you could do. And it all starts with these conservative principles that government should not be the dictator of your future. If you look around the world, unfortunately, that's not true. It's very hard to get ahead, of course, in a communist or socialist country, but even in places like Europe. And so my mom legitimately told me, even though my mom was not married when I was born, we lived in public housing, she legitimately could tell me, thank God you're in America, because there's no limitation. And there really wasn't. If you look at our kids today, if we don't go back to the conservative principles that this country was set up, it's not true for anybody. And it really doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. There's going to be this elite that's going to take care of you, but the opportunities keep going away. And so I actually believe in it, because I always think about my job is if I could get back to the country that my mom raised me in that said you could be anything, that's a hell of a place. And if we don't, it's a pretty screwed up society and makes it very difficult for crime to go down, for people to have opportunities, all the things.
Ron?
You know, the one essential ingredient to America is freedom, right? That's conservatism. We realize that it is our God-given right to be free. That's what allows us to dream and aspire and build and create this marvel that is America. But the higher value, from my standpoint, is truth. So as conservatives, those are the two things we have to fight for. Freedom, make sure that your children jealously guard their liberty and freedom. And then we need to relentlessly pursue the truth and expose it. That's what gives me hope, because truth, I believe, has the power to overcome the lies, the evil that we're seeing in our society right now. So freedom and truth.
Truth will set you free, right, Ron? Mike, close us out here.
It's important to focus always as conservatives on government, on its purpose, on what it is. Government is just the use of force. It's not omniscient, it's not omnipotent, it's not benevolent. It's just force. Now, we need it. We need it to make sure we don't kill each other, take each other's stuff, or fall victim to those from the outside who would do the same. But it's just force. So we got to manage it appropriately. To manage it appropriately, you got to understand what it is. I'm an Anglophile, and it breaks my heart to see what happened to the Conservative Party in the UK last week. But what happened to the Conservative Party in the UK last week, it unfolded in slow motion over the course of years. Years in which, during Conservative Party rule, the Conservative Party responded to public input and the consistently liberal, universally liberal, progressive coverage by the media by trying to meet their progressive counterparts halfway to the middle, always moving in their direction. And what happened? Well, the result was as predictable as it was tragic. They lost contrast. The minute you lose contrast, you have no reason to exist. They see no reason. Your own voters have no reason to show up and support you. So look at Ron Johnson, for example. He comes from a purple state. And yet Ron Johnson is as hard-charging a conservative as you'll find. Not in spite of, but in part because of the fact that he comes from a purple state. We've got to stop assuming that we win more elections and we do better when we act more like Democrats. We don't. That's how we lose. And then finally, look at the UK also from the standpoint of Brexit. What animated, what gave vitality to the conservative movement there really had a whole lot to do with Brexit. And Brexit was all about maintaining national identity and maintaining a sovereignty of a government so that it didn't bleed together with all the other governments of Europe and of the world. This is a threat that we face here in different ways. It's not quite the same as what they face in Europe, but I can't tell you how many times I'm approached about ratifying this or that treaty or signing on to this or that legislative proposal because all the other nations are doing it, all the while relinquishing our own sovereignty. The people on the left, the progressive Democrats out there will tell you over and over again, we need a seat at the table. Nonsense, we are the table. They'll tell you over and over again, this is about democracy. Anytime you hear progressive Democrats say this is about democracy, they mean the precise opposite of that. It's like when Prince Harry, an actual prince, a literal descendant of King George III, started lecturing us about the fact that the Dobbs decision was somehow undemocratic. What? Anytime they say democracy, they mean something very different than that. In any event, we're a constitutional republic, not a freaking democracy. Thanks.
All right, three of the best minds in the conservative movement. Thank you all. Thank you, the senators.